In this video, I'm going to test out priming models in the cold winter temperatures and what happens when you leave those miniatures outside to dry. I always prime my miniatures before painting them, and terrain and vehicles too. I prime those as well. It helps the paint to stick to the surface of the model or the terrain or whatever, and it's just a good idea. This is not controversial, right? A lot of people, most people do this. And when I first started getting into the hobby, I generally used primer from a spray can or a rattle can is another term for it. Sometimes it was the fancy stuff that you get from the hobby store, and sometimes it was automotive primer from the auto parts store. I also used the camouflage spray can colors from Krylon and Rust-Oleum quite a bit. But there was always an issue with spray can priming, and that was the weather. I live in Wisconsin, and it's pretty cold here during certain parts of the year, specifically colder than the kind of recommended temperature range for most spray can primers. Spray cans will tell you right there on the label, to only use them between certain temperatures, not too high and not too low. Therefore, I'd be on the last warm day of late autumn outside spraying all kinds of minis and terrain and stuff, so I'd have things to paint over the long and cold winter. But did I need to rush and spray in just those temperatures? Or are those temperatures just a suggestion? I've seen plenty of videos on YouTube of people spraying minis outside in very cold temperatures, right, to show that it can be done. What did most of those videos have in common, however? Some of them, heat up the spray can in warm water. Some even, warm up the models themselves. But in every one of the videos that I've seen, they end up bringing the models inside, out of the cold, to dry and to cure and to outgas. I never saw a video where someone leaves the stuff that they spray out in their freezing garage or whatever overnight. And that's a problem, in my opinion. When I use a spray can to prime minis or terrain or whatever, let's say during the non-winter part of the year, then I leave the sprayed model out in the garage overnight. When you rattle can prime something, first the paint has to dry and kind of set up a bit, and then it has to cure. And during this whole time, the propellant that was released from the can with the paint when you sprayed it, it needs to outgas from the drying and curing paint. Kind of it traveled along and then it hits the model and it's sort of trapped in there, I think, and then it comes out, and that's what causes the smell. And that's why I generally leave the stuff that I've sprayed out in the garage. I don't want to stink up my house with the propellant smell. I remember reading something somewhere long ago that if you let your models stay outside in cold conditions after spraying them, then they'd take much longer to dry / cure, right? Which does make sense. The common wisdom is that paint does take longer to dry in the cold. And the surface would then get weird, was the other thing that they said in that article. I remember the specific example being kind of like an orange peel, right? Which is to say, covered in little indentations as opposed to bumps sticking up. This is why I always stayed away from rattle can priming in the winter, and why I ended up buying an airbrush. With an airbrush, you can prime inside whenever you like. There's no terrible smell if you're using just regular acrylic paints, because the propellant in that situation is just compressed air from the room that you're in, which was compressed by, your air compressor. Now, if you use enamels or lacquers and you spray those through your airbrush, then they will give off their own kind of fumes as they get atomized or whatever, and you'll want to ventilate that. But otherwise, you've got no problems when you use normal acrylics through your airbrush. Prime your minis on the coldest day of the year, and then let them, dry and cure right there on your desk. It's very simple. That's how I do my miniatures still to this day. However, terrain is a different story. Terrain generally takes more of a beating than your miniatures do. You're a bit less gentle with it than you are with your precious miniatures. I've been 3D printing a lot of terrain lately with my Bamboo Lab A1 filament printer, and I prefer to prime that kind of stuff with a rattle can versus using my airbrush. So I've been generally limited to priming when the weather is nice. Again, so I have terrain projects to paint over the winter. But recently, I've been curious if temperature is really that important. So it was time for science. It's good, too, because it's really cold in the studio today. I printed 4 more statues from the Ruins of Perdition line from our friends over at Mini Wargaming. Link in the description down below. They're the same statues that I used in last week's science video about texturing terrain, Pachow. And I was going to test these new ones that I was printing in several different ways. Firstly, I was going to use my go-to ride or die spray can primer of choice these days, Rust-Oleum Professional High Performance Enamel Spray Paint in matte black. Is this stuff technically primer? I don't think so, but my friend Joe from Death Ray Designs suggested it to me years ago, and it works like a charm, and it's in a bigger than usual can. I use this stuff these days on nearly every terrain piece that I produce. It's amazing. It never lifts off of the surface, no matter how much wash or speed paint I flood it with. And it's generally half the price of Games Workshop's Chaos Black Spray, and it comes in a bigger can than theirs does as well. I get mine, in the local hardware store, but there's a link in the description down below if you can't find it by you. My plan was to use it on 2 of the statues and then bring one inside to dry and cure, and then leave one outside in the cold garage and see what happens. Like I said, science. I stuck them both to a painting stick and then headed outside into the cold. It was 9 degrees Fahrenheit, or negative 12.7 degrees Celsius, when I walked outside and got ready to spray. I didn't heat the rattle can in a bowl of warm water or anything like that. I just held the can underneath my arm inside my jacket after shaking it really well in the house. I keep the cans in the house all the time, of course, because I'm pretty sure that rattle cans can freeze in the winter, and I don't want to find out firsthand what happens when they do. I set the statues on a big ratty cardboard box that I keep in the unheated garage for spraying stuff just like this, and I started spraying. First thing I noticed, the paint didn't dry on the models as quickly as I was used to. Like when I'm normally out in the summer or even the fall or the spring or whatever, spraying stuff, it dries a bit quicker when I spray it, and this stuff was staying wet and shiny a little bit longer. Otherwise, there were no other issues. Okay, well, that's not totally true. Technically, I had stuck both statues to the same stick, thinking that I was being smart, right? But then I had to bring one of those statues into the house and leave one outside while they were still wet. I could have waited for the 2 statues to dry enough to remove one and then bring it into the house without getting paint all over my hands, but then that would mess up the science because they'd be both sitting out in the cold for longer. So I just grabbed the wet model as best as I could, sort of close to the base and everything like that, without touching too much of it. And I brought it in, to the house. But there, were consequences, however. Now, when I brought the model in the house, I didn't just leave it around to stink up the place, which was kind of the whole point of this experiment is, not stinking up your entire house. I put it instead in a ventilation enclosure that I bought years ago to keep my resin 3D printer that I have yet to have ever used in, right? The enclosure is ventilated outdoors. I drilled a hole in my house and everything, and it's ventilated with a hose that goes outside, and there's an electric fan in the hose and everything like that. And it works really, really well to outgas your rattle can primed models as well. So win-win. I set the statue in there and then turned on the fan to medium, and then I zipped the enclosure back up again. I went back upstairs and then I washed the paint off of my hands. And then it was time for the second phase of the sciencing. Like I said, I've been 3D printing a lot of terrain lately, and though my printer prints things pretty smoothly, there are still sometimes like layer lines that will show up on the prints. To help combat this, I've started spraying 2 different rattle cans over most of my 3D prints when I'm priming them. Therefore, I wanted to test that as well, more for myself, really more than anything, honestly, just to make sure that, So I took the 2 other statues that I had printed outside again, this time on 2 separate paint sticks, learning, from the previous experiment, and I sprayed them black again. Then, the step 2 that I've been using lately, I sprayed a second layer, kind of a zenithal spray from above, right, with Rust-Oleum filler primer in a light gray color. Again, I just dusted it over the top of the terrain piece with the hope that that thicker filler primer will, kind of hide some of the uppermost layer lines. We generally look at our terrain from above, right? So I didn't see any need to try and spray this stuff on the underside of anything, right? Just on the top. Once I had done both of these models, again outside, then it was time to bring one model in the house, and they were on separate sticks, so it was way easier, and then leave the other one out in the cold. Then it was a waiting game. I let all 4 of these test subjects rest for a full 24 hours before I started checking out the results. My hypothesis was that the stuff that dried and cured inside would probably be fine, and the stuff that cured outside in the unheated garage would not be fine. I wasn't sure how bad it would look, but the temperature had stayed pretty steady overnight, so I felt that the outside would still look different than the inside stuff, right? Like I grabbed the stuff from my basement, and it looked fine, like I expected, and then I wrote inside on the bottom of both pieces so that I could tell them apart, and then, grabbed the stuff from outside. The outside stuff looked great. I brought it in and compared it side by side with the inside, test subjects sitting on my hobby table. And I wrote, outside on the bottoms of the pieces that had spent the night in the garage. But otherwise, they looked exactly the same to me, which I was not expecting. Putting them side by side and comparing them visually, I couldn't find a difference. I at least expected to see some sort of weirdness from the filler primer, as, like I said, it's a bit thicker and a bit kind of self-leveling. Curing in below freezing temperatures seems like way out of its safety zone temperature-wise, but it was fine. The only tangible difference that I could find was that if I held the pieces to my nose and sniffed, right, real close, the inside pieces had slightly less stink than the outside pieces. Now, let me be clear, I couldn't smell any of the pieces until I got them literally within a few inches of my nose. They weren't just still stinking up the place. They had outgassed properly, but when you get close, you could still smell it. And, like I said, I could smell the pieces that had slept in the garage a little bit more than the ones that had slept in the basement in a ventilated enclosure thingy. My assumption is that the off-gassing process of the propellant is harder or maybe slower for it to work in low temperatures or something, but I'm not really sure. I'll be honest, this is not what I expected. I had always heard for years that while you can rattle can primer your models in the cold and the winter, you can't keep them outside to dry in that same temperature of cold or you'd get bad results. I got great results out of both options, and I didn't have to heat up the spray can or the models or do anything fancy like that at all. It was really easy. Now, this might be due to the 2 specific paints that I personally used, and maybe different paints or primers might act differently, but it went really better than I had expected. What this means for me is that I can spray can prime my 3D printed terrain projects all winter long, specifically if I keep using the same combination of the black enamel stuff and then the gray spray primer or gray filler primer stuff over the top of it, right? Like that, you might want to try 1 or 2 of these spray cans that I mentioned yourself, or maybe do your own experiment in the cold with the rattle cans that you prefer to use and see if it works out for you. Did these results surprise you? Have you ever tried this before? Let us all know down in the comments below. An experimental depressmentation of the like button would also be empirically appreciated scientifically. So, there you got that. And while you're down there as well, you could do a little bit more experimentation and click on the subscribe button if you wanted to see more stuff like this every single Friday. It's free. Thanks for watching.